But the first thing to know about pivot tables is that you need to get your data to look right for pivot tables. In the Excel file here, I have a table that looks at video game sales from major video game companies from Electronic Arts, Nintendo, Activision. And this is typically what you might see in a report or in a PowerPoint slide deck. You have years along the top from 2010 through 2015. You have the companies, the Electronic Arts, plus the individual devices like the PC, PS2, these are PlayStation. So you have all these different devices. And then in the middle of the table, you have all the revenue, which is in millions. So just going from left to right, you have millions in dollars of revenue from 2010 through 2015 from columns A through G. So it is tempting to put all of this data into a pivot table because I want to maybe have a better way of summarizing this revenue. So a lot of entry level, or I guess new analysts who don't really know how to use pivot tables, what they'll do is take the data, select it, and then just create a pivot table off of that data. And if you do that, hit insert pivot table, hit OK, you notice that the fields or columns that you have are the years, which don't really help you that much. You can't really do any kind of trend analysis because now you have to drag each year one by one, as like I'm doing now, into the values. And then for the categories or the sales or the products, you have to drag that into the left-hand side. And now you have to kind of play with the pivot table a little bit to do analysis. So this is not really a great use case for doing data analysis or putting data into a pivot table. So the first thing you have to do is actually transform this data into something that's more easily usable for a pivot table. And what does that mean? The first thing you notice is that the years are along the top and the categories revenue are along the side. I'm going to create a brand new worksheet, and instead here I'm going to put in here something like the word company, and this will be Nintendo for cell A1 and A2. And then for column B1, cell B1, I'm going to write year. So what does that mean? I'm going to put these years, 2010 to 2015, into the year column. So B2 will be 2010, B3 will be 2011, B4 will be 2012, and etc. and etc. Now the company will get repeated down like that from A2 through A7 will just be Nintendo. So now column A is company, which is just Nintendo for now. Column B is year, which is 2010 to 2015. And then column C will be my sales revenue column. And then what I'm going to do is look at my revenue from Nintendo for just 3DS for this case, copy this data, which is currently organized by column, and I have to transpose it so that goes into rows. So I do paste special transpose, and now you see how my revenue is like repeated for each row. So revenues from C2 through C7. This is much different from the summary worksheet, which you see here, because this is tempting because you want to look at your data from column to column, but to get data ready for a pivot table, you need to show everything in a row. And the biggest thing here is that the year and other categories might be duplicated. So I'm going to show you what this data actually looks like from a full perspective. If I go to the data tab, you'll see here that this is what the data actually looks like. That's great for a pivot table. You have a column called name, which is just the name of the video game. You have the year, which is again duplicated across all the rows. You will have multiple years for 2010, 2011, etc. The publisher is Nintendo, that's also duplicated. And you have global sales, which is the number in millions of sales for that specific game, for that specific year, for that specific genre, for that specific publisher. So that's the key thing here, is that you have to learn how to transpose or transform your data from this summary table, which you'll most likely get in some kind of PDF or summary report, and then kind of switch the columns around so that the years are all in the same column but repeated. And then you have the revenue in its own separate column so that this is ready for a pivot table. Now, not only is this important for pivot tables, but this is also important for databases as well. Most data you're analyzing today will most likely come from databases, so your data will already look like this when you pull it from a database, where you have data that's kind of called, I think this is called denormalization, where the data is denormalized. But if you are creating your own data in Google Sheets or Excel, where you're kind of aggregating from multiple data sources, it's important to organize the data like this so that you can organize and analyze this data in a pivot table somewhere down the line, or being able to quickly put this data into a database somewhere down the line if you're working with a data engineer or an analytics engineer who has to upload this data to a MySQL database somewhere in the future once the data becomes very large. So that's the first kind of thing to know about pivot tables, is that just getting the data structured and laid out correctly so that you can put it into a pivot table for analysis is the most important part for using pivot tables for that matter. The second feature about pivot tables that is really important for data analysis is just being able to dig deeper into a specific value in your pivot table. So let's say you've done a bunch of data analysis and create a pivot table that looks like this. You see here I have platform along the rows. So these are things like Super Nintendo, PlayStation, PC, Nintendo. And then in the columns in my pivot table, I have the year. And then in my values, I just have sales. These are global sales for these different platforms for the years 1990 through 1995. So the glory days of video games, if you will. And you can see that Super Nintendo clearly just dominated the video game industry as a platform back in the early 90s. The revenues are over 20 million in 1990, then 30 million in 1992. And I just did some conditional formatting to show that for each year, Super Nintendo was the top platform in sales. But in 1995, PlayStation came out with a bunch of new games, and their revenue jumped from 6 million to 35 million, well, actually 36 million in 1 year, and basically took the market share from Super Nintendo. And so I thought this was interesting. How did PlayStation all of a sudden jump from kind of relative obscurity to being the top platform in video game sales in 1985? So you could go into the raw data set and look at, PlayStation and sort the data here if you want. But an easier thing to do is once you've spotted the trend in your pivot table, you've spotted the trend while doing data analysis, all you need to do is just double click on that cell. So in this case, cell G13 contains that $36 million number. I can just double click that cell, and Excel automatically creates a brand new worksheet for me, and it contains the underlying rows of data that make up that specific number. So this is kind of like, think of this as like a snapshot or a filtered like table of your actual raw data set, which is here in this data tab. So this snapshot of the data, if you just sum up global sales right here, you'll see that this sums up to that $36 million number. And now you can actually see what individual games, what individual publishers contributed to that specific number here that you see here, 36 million in your pivot table. This just breaks it down row by row. And it's almost like you were able to dig into like the database for a specific number. And if I just click on global sales and click on descending to see which video games drove the most sales, the top three in terms of sales by far were Namco Museum Volume 1, this game called Tekken, and the third game was called Rayman, and they each brought in around $3 to $4 million in sales for PlayStation. And that's a really super cool feature about pivot tables, is that you can literally dig deeper into a number and see the underlying data that makes up that number without having to go back into the data table, do a bunch of filtering and sorting to sort on, filter for PlayStation and see what all the sales are. This is a quick and dirty and relatively easy way to figure out what data contributes to those sales. And for those of you who are astute Excel users, you'll notice that this Excel table that shows up when you double click into a number in a pivot table. This is actually an Excel table, which has its own different properties, which we can talk about in a future episode. But that's the second thing to know about pivot tables. You can double click into a number and it automatically brings up the detailed view about that number. Now, the final tip that really makes pivot tables amazing for data analysis is being able to create your own calculations on the fly for data analysis. So in this pivot table, I have platform, which is all the major platforms like PC, PlayStation, etc. I have global sales. I have units sold, but I don't have the average. Well, pretend like I don't have column D, this average sales price. Let's go back to the raw data set. In the raw data set, I only have for each video game global sales and the units sold, but I don't have a column for average retail price. Now that may be interesting to see because you want to know like what was the average, how much did each of these games sell for, year by year as an example. And this is great because this feature in Excel allows you to create calculations no matter what type of metrics you have available in your data set. It's tempting to do this on the back end. It's tempting to say in column I, which is a blank column, I could say average retail price, and then say equals global sales times a million, because these sales are in millions, divided by the units sold. And this is the average retail price for that specific game for that specific year. These numbers are obviously fake, but you should never, ever put totals, averages, sums, or any summary metrics into the raw data of your source table, because that's not going to let you do a pivot table properly when you put this into pivot table. A lot of entry-level data analysts will create this average or sum or whatever column calculating different values within their source table, and then put that calculated like column here inside the pivot table, which is wrong. The right way to do this is to not add that column to your source table and do it within the pivot table settings. You see here I have an average sales price within my pivot table. If I click on pivot table analyze, fields, items, and then calculated field, in this dialog box that comes up, I can click on the drop down and you see I have this average sales price already created. The formula is global sales times 1 million divided by units sold. And when I hit OK, that's this sales price column I can now use in I can use all over my pivot table. So let's say I drag out the platform and I put in the year. I can now get a dynamic average sales price by year using this calculated field. And so this is a really, really interesting feature because you can have, let's say, 5 different metrics or values you put into your values column or values field in your pivot table, but you can calculate unlimited number of quote unquote calculated fields to find different metrics associated with your source data. So this is a really important feature in pivot tables to utilize, and it also makes it really great for analysis because you can calculate metrics beyond what is included in your source table. So that's the third and final tip about pivot tables. And I would be remiss to say if I didn't make a quick plug for my pivot table course. It's an advanced pivot tables course I published a few months ago on Skillshare. It's right here on the screen. It's called Excel Pivot Tables, Advanced Pivot Table Techniques for Analyzing and Presenting Data Faster. Gotten a lot of great feedback about this class. Over 1,000 students have taken the class. I say it's advanced, but I think it's also great for intermediate students. And I discussed things like filtering and sorting, setting up pivot tables, creating pivot charts, getting pivot data. And you can sign up for my link in the show notes, and you can take this class for free for 30 days if you'd like. And that's kind of the quick plug about pivot tables. Since this episode was all about pivot tables, I had to give a plug about my course. And I'll actually be publishing another advanced pivot tables course later this year. So we'll definitely keep everyone updated about that course.